Welcome, listeners, to The Drowsy Historian, where we dive deep into the forgotten, the overlooked, and the oftentimes gritty truths of history. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey back to the medieval era, to the heart of a grand fortress. But this story isn't about the knights, the lords, or the glorious battles. Instead, we're going to walk the dusty, cold corridors of the stables and witness the life of the stable boy, unseen, unacknowledged, and stuck at the bottom of the social ladder. This is a tale of survival, of dreams deferred, and of a world that never sees those who toil quietly in the shadows. It's about the boy who worked tirelessly, not for riches or fame, but for the simple act of caring for the horses, his companions and his only solace. For every high-born knight and noble lord, there was always a servant behind the scenes, never to be seen as anything more than a tool, a means to an end. But what happens when those at the bottom of the ladder dare to dream, when they long for more than the life that's been assigned to them? Let's dive into the story of the stable boy and find out if his dreams can survive the harsh realities of medieval life. Chapter 1: Dawn with the Dung. A day begins before the sun. The fortress was still cloaked in night, stars dim behind the gathering fog, when a stable boy's day began. Not with a yawn and a stretch, but with a jolt, a barked command, a nudge of a boot, or simply the dread of knowing the sun would soon rise, and your work had to already be halfway done. The floor of the stable wasn't straw, it was frozen mud. If you were lucky, your thin linen shirt hadn't stiffened with your own sweat from the day before. If you were unlucky, rats had chewed a hole in the one blanket meant to shield you from the cold. Few people today understand how vital a stable boy was in a medieval fortress. Knights couldn't charge into battle without horses, messengers couldn't deliver crucial letters to allies, nobles couldn't parade through town square on fine stallions. Every movement of power in a fortress began with an animal, and every animal began with the stable boy. Before a knight polished his armor, the boy had already scraped dung from 10 stalls. The work was brutal. At the crack of dawn, before the cook had even stirred her pot, the boy's fingers were already buried in cold, wet hay and manure. Each stall had to be cleaned meticulously. If a single patch was missed and a horse got sick, punishment would fall fast. And it wasn't just about health. A horse that reeked of unclean stables embarrassed its knight. For that, a stable boy could be whipped or denied food for a day. Here's something many don't know. Stable boys didn't just clean, they often had to memorize every detail about every horse. Its preferred gait, its weak leg, its bad temper. One stable boy might care for over a dozen horses. If he mismatched a saddle or tied the wrong feed bag, it was considered negligence. And negligence in the eyes of a baron was akin to sabotage. Even more alarming was the constant danger. Horses were not gentle pets. These were war-trained destriers and couriers, often half-wild, easily startled, and heavy enough to crush a boy's ribs if they kicked out. Broken fingers were common, so were concussions from being thrown against a post. Yet any sign of weakness, a limp, a whimper, was considered laziness. One wrong move and you were accused of slacking or faking injury. You worked through the pain or risked being replaced by the next orphan brought in from the village. Some boys weren't even paid. In many fortresses, stable boys were serfs' children or orphans, considered less than servants. They worked for food alone, sometimes not even that. The promise of one meal at dusk kept them going. Often their dinner was the same oats fed to the horses, boiled in water and scooped from the same buckets. If a boy snuck bread from the kitchen, he could have his ear clipped as punishment. That's not a metaphor. Physical mutilation was a real and legal sentence for thieves in some lordships. They say knights were the glory of medieval war. But what of the boy who brushed the warhorse's coat, who oiled its hooves, who wiped the blood from its flank after battle? That boy had no armor, no sword and no fame. He was a ghost among nobles, a shadow in the stable. His name wasn't recorded in ballads, but his labor echoed in every mounted charge, every noble hunt, every ceremony of pride. You may wonder, why didn't they run? The sad truth is, many stable boys had nowhere to go. They were abandoned children, war orphans, or sons of peasants indebted to the castle. To flee was to risk starving in the woods, or being hunted down as a fugitive. Castles weren't just places of stone, they were cages too, and the stable, they were the dirtiest, coldest wing of that prison. And then came the morning check. Before the sun had warmed the stone walls, the master of horses arrived. He wasn't a kind man, he was a taskmaster with a keen eye and a leather strap. Any smell of rot, any unbrushed flank, any unlatched stall strike, the boy had to stand in line as his work was inspected, like a soldier's gear. One miss and your week was ruined. Yet somehow through all of it, the boy remembered each horse's name. He whispered to them when no one was listening. They were his only companions. And that's another truth people often miss. In the cold, cruel world of a medieval fortress, a stable boy's only friend might have been a restless mare or a tired cart mule. They didn't beat him, they didn't demand perfection, and sometimes when the boy cried at night, they leaned their heads against the stall door and watched him sleep. By the time the sun finally climbed over the tower, the stable boy had already done half a day's work, and not a soul in the great hall noted. The nobles dined, the knights prepped for training, the guards exchanged shifts, but the boy, cheeks covered in ash and sweat, arms red with cold, trudged on, toward another stall, another pile, another saddle buckle to polish, and the day was just beginning.
By the time the rest of the fortress stirred awake, the stable boy had already lost feeling in his fingers. Cold mornings in stone-walled enclosures held on to frost long after the sun came up, and while the upper halls welcomed fires and servants with trays, the stables remained damp and miserable. The boy's hands, wrapped in burlap or bare when the cloth wore thin, worked ceaselessly to haul water from the well, a task made worse by the weight of the iron buckets and the distance back and forth across uneven ground. Most people picture castle life as luxurious or at least bustling with activity, but the truth is, it was segregated by smells. The stables were the lowest tier both in geography and in dignity. There was an unwritten rule in many fortresses: if something stank or had to be cleaned, it was the stable boy's job. Spilled mead in the barracks? Send the stable boy. Rotting fish thrown out behind the kitchens? He'd haul it away. Dead rat in the storehouse? Give the boy a stick and a bucket. He became the all-purpose cleaner for every corner the noble residents didn't want to look at. And if he refused or even hesitated, he might be tied to a post in the yard and whipped in front of the other boys as a lesson. What most people don't know is that there were strict hierarchies even within the servant class. A scullery maid, who scrubbed greasy pots all day, still ranked higher than the stable boy. At least she worked indoors. The stable boy was a creature of the muck. The knight's squires, who might only be a few years older, often mocked him, pushing him into troughs or spitting in his direction. Power trickled down in a fortress, and the stable boy stood at the very bottom of that trickle, often quite literally underfoot. And yet, responsibility crushed him. A forgotten latch, a loose horseshoe, even a missed feed could be catastrophic. War horses were worth a fortune, sometimes more than a peasant family's annual yield, and if one was injured or underfed, the knight might lose face. That loss of honor could cost a squire his promotion, or a baron his tournament victory, so the blame always rolled downhill, and it landed hard on the boy. Even if a horse twisted its leg during training, the stable boy might be blamed for neglecting the beast's temperament. It didn't help that the master of horses rarely explained what to do. Orders were barked in half sentences, often while angry or half drunk. The boy had to observe, memorize, and guess what was expected. There were no manuals, no checklists, no training period. If he asked too many questions, he was called dumb. If he guessed wrong, he was called useless. Many boys grew silent over time, learning to rely on instinct, watching horses the way a hunted creature watches a predator carefully, constantly. One overlooked danger of the job came during shoeing. In some smaller castles where blacksmiths were overworked or away at market, stable boys were ordered to assist in removing or replacing iron horseshoes. With no training and only a pair of rusty tools, they risked splitting the hoof or injuring them. A single wrong tug could mean a kick to the chest or a hand crushed beneath the horse's weight. And because no one ever took a servant's injury seriously, they were expected to keep working. There are records from manorial rolls where injured stable boys were given half rations as punishment for delaying duties, as if their own pain was a sign of laziness. Another grim fact was the proximity to disease, not just from filth, but from the very animals they served. Horses carried lice and ticks. They developed infections,
some of which spread through handling sores or untreated wounds. Respiratory diseases were common, especially in tight, poorly ventilated stables filled with straw dust and dung vapor. A boy might begin his life healthy, but by 15 he coughed blood and wheezed at night. No one thought to treat him. A replacement would be found soon enough. And then there was the humiliation. Boys who tried to steal moments of rest, leaning for a second on a wall, slipping into the shadows for 5 minutes of sleep, were often doused with horsepiss by squires, or mocked by visiting pages. Some were shaved bald as punishment for disobedience or branded as thieves if they took a crust of bread from the fodder pile. And because they worked so closely with animals, people began to treat them as if they were no better than the beasts they tended. Eye contact was discouraged. Speaking back was forbidden, but there were moments, however brief, of strange pride. When a knight's horse galloped into the courtyard gleaming, mane braided and hooves polished, heads turned. The nobility would never admit it, but they knew someone down there had labored through the dark to make it possible. A few older knights, especially those who had once been squires themselves, occasionally nodded to the stable boy or left behind a copper coin, though even that could be confiscated by the master of horses. At night, after the fortress dimmed and the castle gates closed, the boy often wandered into the hayloft and lay with his back on the beams, staring up at the wooden ceiling. He would listen to the soft snorts and shifts of the horses below, their breath rising like fog in the moonlight. In those quiet hours when no one shouted his name or cracked a whip nearby, the boy let himself dream, not of becoming a knight, that was impossible, but perhaps of being a groom in a nobleman's traveling court, with better tools, real clothes, and dreams were dangerous in the medieval world. For a stable boy they were often the only thing that kept his spirit from breaking entirely, but dawn would always come too soon, and with it more hooves, more muck, and no one, not the lady of the hall, not the captain of the guard, would even know his name.
Chapter 2: Hoof, Muck, and Misery. Cleaning stables without gloves. By the second hour after sunrise, the real back-breaking work began. Cleaning the stables wasn't just about removing waste. It was an endless war against filth that seemed to multiply on its own. The horses, especially the larger war horses and pack animals, produced enough dung in a day to fill an entire wheelbarrow. Multiply that by 10, 15, sometimes even 20 stalls, and a stable boy faced a mountain of excrement before breakfast. There were no pitchforks for boys. Those were reserved for the master or senior hands. The boy's tools were crude, often just a split plank or a curved iron scraper tied to a broken broomstick. He had to bend low, scooping the wet straw and compacted dung into a wide basket, then carry it outside to the dung heap. And that heap was not just a pile. It was a steaming, maggot-filled, buzzing mountain that oozed down the slope outside the castle walls. In summer the stench was unbearable. In winter the pile froze in strange, jagged lumps, which meant the basket had to be tipped and kicked until the waste came loose. The job was made worse by the conditions underfoot. The stable floor was never level. It sloped towards central drains or rough channels dug by hand, filled with filth and never fully dry. If a boy slipped, and they often did, he landed face first in a mix of urine, rotted straw, and old dung. Many boys bore permanent rashes or sores on their legs from standing in filth all day. Some wore strips of cloth around their feet instead of shoes, soaked through within minutes. Gloves were unheard of. Bare hands became cracked, raw, and infected. And once blood touched that mess, infection set in fast. Many stable boys lost fingernails not from injury, but from decay. It was common for younger boys to develop red streaks up their arms from minor cuts exposed to bacteria. No one treated these. Salves and herbs were for the valuable men or at best the kitchen staff. A stable boy with a festering wound wrapped it in hay or cloth and hoped it didn't turn green. If he slowed down, someone else would take his place. But it wasn't only waste that made the job hellish. Every morning, the boy had to check the hooves. Stones often got lodged in the clefts, and a limping horse could be mistaken for laziness by the master of horses, or worse, by a knight. So the boy had to kneel in straw, sometimes under a restless, angry beast, and pick at its hooves with a splintered knife. One misstep, and the horse might crush his toes. Kicks to the chest or shoulder were common. Many boys bore bent fingers or limped from old injuries no one cared to record. Another forgotten detail was feeding time.
Horses were fed a mix of hay, grain, and sometimes mashes made of boiled beans or chopped roots. The boy had to portion it carefully. Too much grain could cause colic. Too little and the horse would weaken. And if a noble's mount so much as sneezed the next day, the boy would be blamed. He had no access to veterinary care. His entire knowledge of horse health came from whispered instructions or watching others work. Sometimes when a horse fell ill, he was forced to watch it die writhing in the straw while flies gathered, knowing it might be his fault and that punishment would follow. There was no dignity in the job, only silence. The boy couldn't complain, not even to other boys. Speaking during labor was discouraged. If you were overheard grumbling, it meant your heart wasn't in the work. And if your heart wasn't in the work, then maybe you didn't need to eat that night. Worse, the stable master might report you to the steward, who had the authority to reassign disobedient boys to worse jobs like cleaning latrines or handling swine. Compared to that, stables were a blessing. Some castles had separate buildings for horses and livestock, but in many poorer keeps they were all under one roof. The boy shared his day with not just horses but pigs, chickens, dogs, and vermin. Fleas and lice were everywhere. Rats ran between the feed sacks. Chickens pecked at wounds. Biting flies swarmed any exposed skin. He could never scratch or shoo them away without being scolded. And washing, that was a luxury. He might rinse his hands once a week, his body once a season if the water wasn't frozen or stolen by higher-ranking servants. Yet among all this filth, appearance still mattered. Saddle cloths had to be brushed, harnesses oiled, bits scrubbed until they gleamed. And it was the boy who did it, crouched in the muck, polishing leather until his arms shook. If the tack wasn't ready by the time a knight marched into the stable, the boy would be shoved aside, perhaps beaten. Yet if it was perfect, no one said a word. One might think at the very least the boy could find solace in the animals. But even that was complicated. Horses were temperamental. Some were gentle, but many were skittish or aggressive. A boy who grew too attached risked heartbreak. If a horse was sold, slaughtered, or lost in battle, the boy had to watch it go, and he was expected to do so without emotion. Crying was a weakness, and weakness was dangerous in the fortress. There were older stable hands too, men who had once been boys like him. Most were bitter, angry, broken in body. They passed on cruelty like tradition. One man might steal the boy's bread. Another might force him to do double labor just for the amusement of watching him stagger. There was no mentorship, only survival. Still, somehow the boy kept moving. Scrape, haul, dump. Scrape, haul, dump. Hour after hour. The sun crept across the stable doors, marking time like a judge counting down to sentence. There was no end, only repetition. And while the nobles dined on roasted meat and wine, the stable boy chewed on hard bread if he had any, seated alone beside the dung heap, smelling like the thing he was expected to become: invisible.
By midday, the stink had worked its way deep into the skin. The boy couldn't smell it anymore, but others could. Nobles passing near the stables turned up their noses, muttered insults under their breath, or flung old scraps at him like he was a dog. The worst offenders were squires. Still young, still desperate to assert rank, they mocked him for his torn shirt, his dung-caked boots, his sunburnt neck. Yet the boy said nothing. Speaking back was a privilege he did not own. Even a glance could be interpreted as insolence, and insolence, for someone in his position, could lead to a beating or being locked overnight in the dung pit. The labor didn't stop after the stalls were clean. There were troughs to scrub, fly traps to set, walls to sweep. Then came harness inspection. Leather cracked easily when left to dry. The boy had to oil it using lard or fish oil, rubbing it by hand until it softened. If he missed a strap or failed to remove a grain of rust from a metal buckle, the saddle could slip mid-ride. That could mean a thrown knight, a broken limb, even a duel over perceived sabotage. No one asked if the boy meant it. Intent was irrelevant. Results were everything. One thing few people realize is how vital stable boys were during military campaigns. When a lord raised banners and gathered men for battle, horses had to be prepared for long journeys. That meant feeding them extra, brushing them daily, inspecting hooves twice as often. All of that fell to the boy. During wartime, he might sleep beside the animals, waking every hour to tend to them or calm them if drums and shouting startled them at night. Sometimes the boy was even forced to travel with the army,
not as a soldier but as a caretaker. He'd walk beside the cavalry, pulling feed sacks, carrying water skins, massaging the legs of exhausted mounts. No glory, no pay, and yet without him half the horses would collapse before reaching the battlefield. If they did, it was his fault. If they didn't, no one remembered. Diseases spread quickly in stables, and not just to animals. The mixture of heat, humidity, manure and blood created a perfect breeding ground for infection. One rare but deadly illness, glanders, could pass from horse to human, especially through open cuts. It caused sores, fever, and in many cases death. Stable boys weren't warned about this. They learned only when a friend fell ill and never returned. Beyond disease, there was the unspoken threat of punishment from higher staff. The master of horses often ruled the stables like a petty tyrant. His word was final. If he disliked a boy, he could assign the worst jobs indefinitely, or worse, have him transferred to the kennels where hounds were trained to kill. Those boys had even shorter lifespan. There are documented cases in manorial records where stable boys were charged with theft after being caught eating oats from the storage bin. These weren't luxurious oats, but spoiled, moldy feed not fit for the horses. Yet for stealing, a boy might be branded or publicly flogged. One account from a 13th century fortress in Normandy describes a boy beaten so badly for drinking water from a knight's bucket that he lost vision in one eye. No apology, no justice, just a quiet replacement within the week. The stable was a strange place at night. Lit only by a few tallow candles, it felt both eerie and oddly peaceful. The horses shifted in their sleep. The boy would often lie near them, exhausted beyond thought, straw poking into his skin, ears buzzing from silence after hours of constant clamor. Sometimes he talked to them. He gave them names if they didn't already have them, whispered stories about running away, about finding a place where people didn't scream or strike. Occasionally, a horse responded, a snort, a gentle nudge. Those were the moments that hurt the most, because they reminded the boy what kindness felt like. The animals, even the dangerous ones, were more forgiving than the people above. They didn't mock, they didn't muck, they didn't punish for mistakes. They simply existed, demanding care but never cruelty. But dreams didn't last long. The master would stomp in, barking orders. One horse had rolled too far onto its side, another had eaten too little. A knight needed his steed ready for a torchlit ride. The boy stumbled upright, eyes half closed, muscles screaming. Sleep wasn't sleep anymore. It was a brief collapse between commands. One rarely acknowledged aspect of castle life is that stable boys aged faster than others. A 10-year-old in the stables looked 15 by the time he turned 12. Hard labor bent their backs early. They walked with limps from old injury. Their fingers curled unnaturally from years of rope burns and blisters, and when they reached 15 or 16 they were often cast aside in favor of a new, younger boy. There was no reward for endurance, only replacement. Some managed to secure better positions, grooms, messengers, even squires if luck and patronage aligned, but most vanished into the dirt from which they'd come. No headstones, no stories, just bones among dung heaps, forgotten by the very fortress they had helped run. And still the next morning, another boy would rise before the sun, drag his aching limbs to the trough, and begin again.
Chapter 3: Frozen Fingers. Angry nights. Winter workload. Winter was the season that truly broke the body. In the heart of a stone fortress where walls trapped the cold and the wind howled through open cracks like a wolf in heat, the stable became a place of misery, even more unbearable than in summer. For the stable boy there was no change in schedule. Dawn still meant rising in darkness, though now the darkness lasted longer, and the air bit deep into the lungs with each breath. If his hands had hurt in the warmth of summer, now they simply stopped responding. Fingers went numb, lips cracked and bled, and skin around the knuckles split open from constant contact with frozen water, iron and wood. The worst of it began even before chores. Crawling out of the hay pile that barely passed for a bed meant separating yourself from the only warmth you would feel all day. There were no cloaks, no lined boots. If the boy had an old tunic, he layered it with a second shirt if he was lucky enough to own one. Most days he wore the same tattered clothes through the snow and sleet that soaked through within minutes. Once wet, they froze stiff, and yet the horses waited. Hooves didn't stop growing, dung didn't stop piling,
Saddles still needed repair. Everything had to be done. Only now the tools were frozen to the touch and the ground was a slab of ice. Buckets of water turned to slush overnight. Drawing fresh water from the well became a trial of endurance. The ropes froze to the winch and the boy had to pour hot water over the gears to move them, if he could even find hot water. More often than not, he used his own body heat, clutching the rope to his chest and blowing on the pulley until he could force it to turn. Then he carried the buckets, arms shivering, the water sloshing over the edges, soaking his sleeves and gloves if he had them. By the time he reached the troughs, his hands were red and raw, sometimes stuck to the iron handles, tearing skin as he pulled away. Feeding the horses became even more delicate in winter. Their appetites grew with the cold, and their tempers grew worse. A hungry warhorse in freezing weather was a dangerous thing. They bucked and snapped, eyes wild, kicking at the stalls and slamming their heads against wooden doors. A stable boy learned to move fast to feed them before they got restless. But the hay was frozen too and grain often clumped with moisture, attracting mold. If a horse ate moldy grain and fell ill, the knight would want someone punished. That someone was never the steward or the grain merchant or the lord's steward. It was always the stable boy. The hooves cracked faster in winter, the shoes wore down quicker on frozen ground, and every ailment the horse suffered worsened tenfold. A small stone caught in the frog of the hoof became an infection. A limp became lameness. The boy had to spot these issues early, but winter light came late and disappeared early. Most days he worked by torchlight or under a flickering lantern, kneeling in slush, trying to see through fogged breath and stinging wind. If he failed to notice a limp or a bruise, it meant hours of blame and humiliation. Sometimes there are records from eastern England that describe stable boys whose hands became so frostbitten they turned black and had to be lanced. One squire even noted, in a rare piece of writing that survives, that his stable boy lost 3 fingers in a single winter. The Lord didn't replace him out of sympathy, but because he could no longer grip a harness properly. Boys weren't people in the eyes of the ruling class. They were tools, worn out and discarded, and yet the boy still swept the frozen stone. He still picked ice from the horse's shoes, pulled hay from frost-covered lofts, and cut rope with a rusted knife so stiff it barely moved. There were no fireplaces in the stables, a small brazier, maybe, if the master allowed it, but more often he simply expected the boy to keep moving and the cold wouldn't kill you. Stop, and you'd stiffen. Freeze. Sleep became shorter and more dangerous. Lying still for too long could lead to sickness. But work didn't end with daylight. On feast nights or snowbound hunts, knights often wanted their horses ready at odd hours. The boy would be shaken awake, dragged from half-frozen slumber to saddle a restless beast, brush off the ice, re-oil the tack and hold the reins while the noble mounted. And once the horse galloped off into the dark, he had to stand there and wait, breath fogging, joints aching, until the night returned, sometimes in hours, sometimes not at all. During those waits, stable boys sang to themselves, not loudly, just low enough to keep the blood flowing. Some hummed old songs their mothers used to sing, though few remembered the words. Others spoke to the horses, anything to keep the mind awake, because if you fell asleep standing, you might not wake up at all. More than a few boys were found frozen in corners, slumped beside a warm wall or curled against a bale of hay, eyes open and limbs stiff. Death didn't come dramatically, it came quietly, like the cold itself, and the body was always removed without ceremony. Tossed into a cart, buried in a pit outside the walls. No marker, no candle, no name. Another boy would be brought in from the village, younger maybe, smaller, with clearer eyes, and he'd be shown the same stalls, the same troughs, the same tools, and given the same warning: don't complain, just work. Despite everything, the fortress looked beautiful in winter. The snow softened its brutal walls. The towers glistened, the noble women wore fur-lined gowns, and the knights rode out with banners flying, red and gold against the white sky. Visitors saw majesty, but behind the scenes in the shadows of the stable one boy shoveled frozen dung with cracked hands and whispered to himself just to remember he was alive.
The cold didn't just freeze the limbs, it hardened the heart. By the dead of winter, the stable boy's world shrank into a cycle of pain management. Every chore became a negotiation with frostbite.
Gripping the iron hinges of the stable doors sent shocks through his bones. Every step on frozen dung threatened a fall. But slipping wasn't just dangerous. It was shameful. If anyone saw him fall, laughter would follow. Cruel jokes too. The lowest-ranking squire might call him four legs, or mud sniff, and the other boys would laugh, not because they wanted to, but because if they didn't, they'd be next. The worst days came during storms. Snow piled so high against the doors that they had to be dug open from the inside. The boy would wake up to find the stable dark and suffocating, light blocked by white drifts. With no shovel of his own, he used a broken board or his bare hands. Sometimes it took an hour just to push the door wide enough to squeeze through. And outside, the wind whipped so hard it peeled cloth from skin. The path to the feed barn disappeared under layers of ice. He'd follow fence posts like landmarks, each one a milestone of survival. There were days when he returned with no feeling in his feet, collapsing just inside the doorway, his breath rasping like someone twice his age. Even simple sounds changed in winter. The squeak of a gate hinge became a scream. The clop of hooves on ice echoed across the courtyard like thunder. But no one heard the sounds of suffering in the stables. The cold muffled the boy's coughs, his wheezing, his chattering teeth. Even if he had the courage to speak, his lips often wouldn't move properly. They cracked and split. Blood crusted along the edges. Water offered no relief. It froze in his cup before he could drink it. Bathing, already rare, became impossible. There was no heated water for him. No warm stones. No privacy. Sores formed where sweat met friction under frozen clothing. Rashes turned purple. And still the boy had to stand straight, keep his head down, and greet the nights with a yes, my lord, every time they barked. Some of those knights, shielded in wolfskin cloaks and iron spurs, had once been stable boys themselves. You might think that made them kinder, more understanding, but it often made them worse. They saw in the boy a reflection of their own weakness, something to be punished before it grew. One little-known fact about winter in the stables: rats multiplied. Driven from the icy fields and kitchen scraps, they nested in haylofts, under floorboards, even inside the grain sacks meant for horses. The boy had to stomp them out, kill them with sticks, or sometimes sleep near them. And not all rats were small. Some grew fat off waste and bone. There are stories written in the margins of old stable logs, of boys who woke up to rats chewing their toes or ears. Nothing woke you faster in the dark than the scrape of teeth on frozen flesh. The work never lightened. Winter festivals meant more visitors, more horses, more men. Nobles brought guests who demanded fresh straw, clean tack, and warm feed. Of course, none of them did it themselves. The boy doubled his rounds, sometimes moving between 3 sets of horses in an hour. On St. Stephen's Day, the lords celebrated with hunt, but before they could gallop into the woods, the boy had to fit fresh bridles, wipe hooves clean, and test saddles for tears. A single missed stitch could mean a torn girth strap, and if a nobleman fell from his mount, there'd be punishment swift and brutal. When injuries happened, when the boy twisted an ankle on ice, or split his hand open on a frozen bridle, he was given no reprieve. There was no physician for servants. If he asked to rest, he was called weak. If he cried, he was laughed at. Pain became routine. The only relief was found in numbness. A boy who could no longer feel his injuries was considered more useful than one who could. And eventually that became his goal, not to heal but to adapt. In the rare moment of rest, he might crouch behind a pile of hay, curl into his own arms, and watch the steam rise from the horse's breath. He didn't feel sorry for himself. There wasn't time for that. Instead, he wondered if he'd live to see another summer, or if he'd become like the others who disappeared after a particularly hard frost, buried without a name, remembered only by the new boy who took their place. One of the strangest truths about medieval stables is how isolated they were from the rest of the castle. Not physically, they were usually just beyond the courtyard, but socially, they were another world. The kitchen maids, the laundresses, the pages, they all had their own spaces, their own gossip. But the stable boy worked alone. He was seen but not spoken to. His meals, when they came, were dropped in bowls on the floor of the tack room. He ate beside the dogs, sometimes fending them off to get a full bite. In that solitude, he began to see the horses as his only family.
He gave them names the knights never knew. He talked to them in whisper. He brushed their manes with care, not because he was ordered to, but because they were the only living beings that didn't treat him like filth. If a horse nudged him gently, he took it as a gift. If one remembered his voice and turned its head when he entered the stall, he smiled, just a little. Those moments saved him, just barely. And still the cold returned every morning. The world never softened. The hoarfrost bit into his eyebrows, the snow crept into his boots, and the iron never warmed in his hands. But he woke, he rose, he scraped the waste, filled the buckets, and whispered to the horses again. Because he didn't have a choice.
Chapter 4. The beatings were frequent. Discipline for servants. Discipline inside a medieval fortress wasn't about fairness. It was about order, control, fear. For a stable boy who lived at the very base of the hierarchy, punishment was never far away. The fortress may have had laws and customs, but they did not shield him. His body was considered part of the machinery of the household, and if that machine failed, or even seemed slow, it was struck until it worked again. Punishment wasn't always physical. Sometimes it began with humiliation. If the master of horses found a single straw out of place in a stall, he might drag the boy by the collar through the courtyard for others to see. The walk was the first strike, eyes watching, some laughing, others pitying but saying nothing. Then came the scolding, loud and public, meant to remind the boy and every other servant nearby that disobedience had consequences. But more often than not, the punishment escalated. Whips were common, but not the elegant kind shown in painting. These were rough leather strips soaked in water to make them heavier. A stable boy could be struck across the back or legs for being late, for feeding the wrong oats, for not bowing low enough. The blows weren't counted or recorded. There was no limit. If the master's mood was dark, or if he'd been scolded by a knight himself, the beating might go on until the boy collapsed. Some lords kept stocks in the yard. These weren't for criminals. They were used to shame servants. A boy caught napping or talking out of turn might be locked in for hours, his hands and neck squeezed in cold wood while others passed by mocking or ignoring him. It was meant to teach obedience, but what it really taught was silence. There are forgotten records in manorial accounts where beatings were considered part of the monthly routine. One steward noted in Latin that his stable boy was corrected by lash for insolence and poor stall hygiene. That note came beside a tally of oats and horseshoes, as if lashes were just another item in the inventory. There was no awareness that the boy might have been exhausted, hungry or injured. Those didn't matter. He was a tool. A tool didn't complain. A tool got repaired or discarded. Sometimes older boys turned on younger ones. The fortress hierarchy encouraged it. Those who had suffered in their early years often saw cruelty as a rite of passage. They passed down the pain as if it were tradition. A boy just arrived from a nearby village might be tripped, slapped, or sent on impossible errands, just for entertainment. And if he failed, it was his fault for not adapting quickly enough. One of the lesser-known facts about medieval castles is that many had silent rules, punishments that were not spoken of but understood. A stable boy who let a horse loose, even if by accident, might be denied food for days. If a tack broke during a noble's ride, the boy might be forced to sleep outside even in winter with no blanket. No one explained the rules in words. You learned them through bruises. There was also the threat of being turned out. To be dismissed from a fortress was not a release. It was a death sentence. A stable boy who failed enough times could be stripped of his position, his meager meals and his sleeping corner, and sent away with nothing. No coin, just the clothes he wore and whatever scraps he could steal without being caught. Many didn't make it past the first village. A lone boy on the road was a target for thieves, or worse, conscription. Even when the beatings stopped, the fear didn't. Every task became a test. Every look from a superior was a question. Had he done enough? Was he fast enough? Clean enough? If not, the cane might return, the boot might fly, and the others boys' squires, sometimes even knights, would watch. Maybe they'd turn away, maybe they'd laugh, but they wouldn't help. There were of course moments when no one noticed the boy at all. He could walk past nobles arguing about war, past cooks yelling about bread, past squires polishing weapons. No one stopped him, because in their eyes he wasn't really there. He was part of the structure, like the stones or the straw, and that was a different kind of punishment. The slow erasure of identity. To exist, to breathe, to struggle, and have no one see you, no name, no memory,
Sometimes, though rarely, a kind soul passed through the fortress. A priest, perhaps, or an old knight too crippled to ride. They might offer a word of praise, a piece of bread, a warm look, but these moments were fragile. The boy learned not to rely on them. He treasured them silently, hid them in the corners of his mind like coins in a shoe. Small tokens that reminded him he was human. The harshest lessons came not from whips but from the injustice. He learned that hard work did not always prevent pain, that obedience could still earn punishment, that the rules bent for the rich and crushed the poor. And yet, every day he returned to the stable, because pain was a given, but hunger, that was worse. He found strange comfort in the routine, in the quiet brushing of a horse's coat, in the rhythmic sound of hooves on straw, in the warmth of an animal's breath when it nuzzled his arm. The world outside those stables was cruel, but inside at least he understood the pattern. Still, his back bore the marks of the last lashing, and he knew it wouldn't be the last.
As time passed, the stable boy's skin grew thick with the blows, not just from the lash, but from life itself. He no longer flinched at the crack of the whip. His muscles no longer screamed when he was forced to run errands or sweep the courtyard. The pain was simply part of him. The lines between suffering and existence blurred. He woke each day knowing it would hurt. He woke each day knowing there would be no mercy. And the strangest thing, he stopped hoping for it. It was the way life worked. Even the harshest of punishments began to feel like routine. A hand raised against him was a symbol of his place. And if he resisted, that would mean even more pain. So he learned not to fight back. Not with words, not with actions. He learned to submit, to bend to the will of those above him. But submitting didn't bring peace. It only brought silence, the silence of knowing that, in the eyes of those around him, he was invisible. But the hardest part of his life was not the punishment itself. It was the realization that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. He could spend all day cleaning hooves, feeding the horses, polishing tack, and still be treated like the dirt beneath his boots. The knight's horse might get a scratch, and the boy would be blamed. The feed might be slightly off, and the boy would be punished. The horses might fight in the stalls, and the boy would be whipped for their aggression. It was a never-ending cycle, always more to do, always more to suffer. But there were moments of calm, brief and fleeting, that offered the smallest form of respite. The dead of night, when the stable was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of hooves or the distant howl of wolves, brought a strange peace. In these hours when no one could see him, the boy would sometimes let his guard down. He'd allow himself a moment to rest against the wall, eyes closed, and for a second feel like he wasn't being watched. He wasn't just a servant. He wasn't just a tool in the fortress's endless machine. For a heartbeat, he was simply human again. But the reality of his situation always returned with the first light of dawn. The master of horses, always harsh, would march into the stable before the sun rose, inspecting the stalls, the tack and the horses. He would walk past the boy without even acknowledging his presence, checking every corner with meticulous, almost cruel precision, and the boy would stand there waiting for the command to move or the reprimand to come. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't ask questions. He was invisible. His only purpose was to work and be silent. It was during these moments of scrutiny that the boy would remember the injustice that had always been a part of his life. The noblemen who paraded around the castle, their fine clothing and jeweled belts, lived lives of luxury and ease, while he worked in filth, shivering in the cold, never knowing a true day of rest. They had nothing to fear, they had nothing to lose. He had nothing but his labor, and even that was only good as long as it was useful to them. The moment it ceased to be of value, he would be discarded, just like the horses who were sold off to the slaughterhouse once they grew too old or too weak. But there was another side to the stable boy's life, a side that few ever saw. While the masters and squires went off to the war, to tournaments, to feast, the boy stayed behind, alone with the animals, and in the solitude, there was a strange connection. He could feel the horses' moods, understand their needs, and even sense when something was wrong. He knew when one of them was sick before the master did. He knew the subtle changes in their behavior, when a horse started to refuse its feed or kicked its stall in distress. These small connections, these moments of understanding, were the only things that gave the boy any sense of worth. They were fleeting, but they reminded him that in some way he wasn't completely invisible.
Even the animals knew him, even the horses acknowledged his presence, and for a brief fleeting moment, he could feel valued. But that was always followed by the harsh reality of his position. The animal care that the boy gave so selflessly was never rewarded. He might spend hours brushing a horse's coat, cleaning its hooves, and yet if a knight found the horse less than perfect, if the saddle was too tight or the reins too loose, the boy would bear the brunt of the punishment. His efforts were never seen, his care was never acknowledged. He was simply a tool, a means to an end, and when the work was done he returned to his corner of the stable, alone once again. Even worse were the days when the knight's horse became ill. No one understood the weight the boy carried when one of the horses fell sick. He knew it wasn't just a sick animal, it was his future on the line. He would spend hours in the stall, watching the animal, making sure it didn't worsen. If it did, if the horse died, the blame would fall squarely on his shoulders. He might be punished for failing to care for it, and that punishment could mean being sent away. The thought of being discarded like the old horse scared him more than any physical blow. But even that fear wasn't enough to break the cycle. Even when he made mistakes, when he missed a hoof or didn't tighten a bridle enough, the boy knew better than to complain. It was the way things worked. He had no choice but to keep going, to keep moving, to keep surviving. And yet there was always hope. It flickered in the quiet moments with the horses, in the days when he felt like he mattered, maybe not to the masters but to the animals. And maybe, just maybe, one day he'd find a way out, a way to escape the endless cycle of work and punishment. But for now it was all he had.
Chapter 5. Rotting rations and sleeping on hay. Food in the medieval fortress wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, and for the stable boy, it was a small piece of relief in a world that often gave nothing but hardship. But even this basic need was out of his control. When he woke in the morning, before the sun even touched the horizon, the first task wasn't to brush his teeth or fetch water. It was to get to the kitchens and hope there was anything left for him. Sometimes it wasn't even that. Meals were scarce and unpredictable. The noblemen and knights ate first, their bellies filled with the best cuts of meat, bread and rich stews. But the stable boy ate what was left. Leftovers from the kitchen, leftovers from the noble table, a scrap of bread, a hunk of gristle, perhaps some cheese that had started to spoil. Sometimes it wasn't even that. Sometimes when the cooks were busy with their orders for the nobles, he was given nothing but dried oats. If he was lucky, there was a piece of fruit, but that wasn't off. What was meant to nourish the horses often ended up in his stomach. Stale oats, mushy grain, hay mixed with roots. It was never fresh, and always just enough to keep him from starving, but never enough to fill him. It was a strange paradox. The boy worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, expending more energy than most people would in a week, and yet he often had to go to bed hungry. The food was rarely enough to satisfy the hunger that gnawed at his stomach. It was a hunger born not just of a lack of food but of injustice. His labor was constant, yet the reward, if you could even call it that, was the bare minimum, a paltry sum compared to what the knights and lords feasted on. The worst part wasn't just the rations, it was the knowledge that no matter how hard he worked, it would never get better. He could scrub the stalls until his fingers bled, he could rub the horses down until his muscles screamed, but none of that mattered. He wasn't meant to eat with the other servants, let alone with the nobles. His place was at the bottom of the ladder, and the food he received reflected that. The cold seasons made it worse. Winter brought scarcity, and the already minimal rations dwindled even further. When the snow piled high outside the walls and the castle became more isolated, food had to be rationed for everyone, and that meant the stable boy saw less. The rich feasted on meats preserved in salt and dried fruits. The boy was lucky if he saw a bowl of porridge in the morning. If it wasn't too thin, if it wasn't too stale. The bitter truth was that he often had to make do with what was left. The scraps the horses didn't eat, the leftovers that no one else wanted. He ate what was available, and often it wasn't enough. There were times when he would sneak a piece of bread from the kitchen, when no one was watching, but this was dangerous. If he was caught, the punishment would be swift. The cook would report him, and the punishment would be swift and brutal. Not only would he be locked in the cellar for hours, forced to smell the smells of rotten fruit and spoiled meat, but the food he had stolen would be considered a serious offense. There was no understanding of hunger, there was only obedience, and to steal, even to stave off hunger, was considered a crime.
So the boy learned to go hungry. He learned to get by with what little he was given. When the food ran out, he would stretch it as far as it could go. A spoonful of oats here, a crust of bread there. Sometimes he would find himself on the edge of passing out from hunger, but he couldn't stop. There was no time to rest, no time to eat. The horses needed him. The stable needed him. The fortress needed him. And if he faltered, there were always consequences. And then there was sleep, if you could call it that. After a long day spent in the freezing cold, scrubbing, feeding and cleaning the stables, the boy would crawl into the hay loft for a few hours of fitful rest. It wasn't a bed. It wasn't even a mattress. It was simply a pile of hay, thrown together in the loft above the stables, where the air was thick with dust and the smell of manure. It was far from comfortable. The hay poked at him, and the cold crept into his bones. There was no warmth, no blanket, only a hard, uncomfortable surface that he would lie on, trying to ignore the pain in his body as he closed his eyes for the few precious hours of sleep he could get. It wasn't much. In fact, it was barely sleep at all. The noise of the horses shifting below him, the wind howling through cracks in the stone walls, the occasional shout from the knights or the master of horses. There was always something to keep him awake, but even then sleep was a reprieve. It was the only time he could forget his troubles, even if just for a moment. It was the only time he could imagine a world where he wasn't a servant, where he wasn't bound to the stables, where he could be free. But the freedom never lasted. The sun would rise again, and with it, the heavy burden of work. The stable boy would rise from his hard bed of hay, his back aching, his stomach empty, and he would begin again. Another day of cleaning, feeding and serving. Another day of subsisting on scraps, living in the shadows of the castle's grand halls. Yet in the silence of the hay loft, before the morning light filled the stables, the boy sometimes dared to dream. He dreamed of a life away from the fortress, away from the horses, and the harsh punishment. He imagined running far away, to a place where he could sleep without the cold creeping into his bones, where he could eat until he was full, where he could wake up without fear of being punished. But those were only dreams, and dreams were not enough to escape the reality of his life. He knew it would never happen. He knew he was trapped in the fortress, bound by the chains of duty and fate. But the dreams persisted, and with each day, he clung to the small moments of relief, the brief seconds of kindness, the fleeting taste of something better than the hardship that defined his existence. Because even a stable boy deserved those moments. Even a servant, forgotten by everyone else, deserved to be seen.
Chapter 6. When horses got sick. You were to blame. A horse's sickness was not just an ailment, it was a catastrophe. And for the stable boy it was an immediate sentence to dread. In the fortress the horses were more than just animals. They were assets, tools of war, status symbols and prized possessions. They carried knights into battle, delivered messages, and paraded through the gates in the Lord's grand procession. If one of these noble steeds fell ill, it was seen as a direct reflection of the stable boy's care, or lack thereof. Horses, like all animals, had their moods, their quirks. Some were temperamental, others more docile. But no matter their nature, each was an important piece of the fortress's operation. And that's where the stable boy's responsibility grew heavy. He wasn't just cleaning stalls or feeding oats. He was monitoring every animal's health. A small sign of illness, a slight limp or a loss of appetite could spell disaster. Not for the horse, but for the boy who had to answer for its well-being. The worst part wasn't the sickness itself, it was the consequences that followed. A horse that ate too much grain might bloat. If it contracted colic, it could writhe in pain for hours. And if the illness wasn't caught early enough, the horse could die. But the real horror was what came after. If the horse died or became too ill to ride, the blame immediately shifted to the stable boy. Whether it was an accident, bad feed, or simply an unlucky twist of fate, it didn't matter. The stable boy was responsible, and that responsibility came with the threat of punishment. The master of horses would storm into the stables, his eyes blazing with anger. He didn't care about the boy's exhaustion, his aches from lifting water buckets, or scraping manure. He cared only for the horse, for the noble mount that was now compromised. The stable boy in his eyes was nothing more than an incompetent caretaker, a failure. And that failure, if allowed to stand, could mean more than just a few harsh words. It could mean a beating, a loss of food,
or worse, being thrown out of the fortress altogether. But even if the horse survived, the boy's burden was not over. Healing a sick horse was no simple task. It required more than just care. It required an understanding of the animal's body and behavior. The boy needed to know when to offer water, when to apply pressure, when to leave the horse alone to rest. He had to learn every possible trick to diagnose and treat the animal's ailment. The master of horses might not be present for hours, leaving the boy alone to decide how best to help. But no matter what the boy did, it would never be enough. The blame would still fall on him. One of the crueler aspects of caring for sick horses was the lack of knowledge available. Unlike today, where veterinarians provide specialized care for animals, the medieval stable boy had no formal training in animal health. He had to rely on trial and error, observing the horses and learning from experience. And even then, the boy could only do so much. There were no proper medicines, no sophisticated treatments, only herbs and crude remedies passed down through word of mouth. If the horse's illness was serious, say it had contracted a fever, or worse, a deadly disease like glanders, it would need to be isolated. But isolation was nearly impossible in the cramped, cold stables. The boy would do his best to separate the ill horse from the others, but there was always the risk of the disease spread. And even if the horse survived, the boy knew that the master of horses would inspect it under a microscope of suspicion. If the recovery didn't go perfectly, the boy would once again be blamed for incompetence. But the boy knew that even a perfectly cared-for horse could still fall sick. Horses were prone to injuries, diseases, and infections that no amount of care could prevent. Horses could fall in the mud and scrape their legs. They could step on rocks and strain muscles. They could pick up parasites from the straw. And it was the stable boy's job to ensure that every injury, no matter how small, was treated swiftly. If it wasn't, the boy would be the one to answer for it when the horse's condition worsened. There was little to no relief when a horse fell ill. When a horse was sick, it became the center of the boy's life. The boy would tend to the horse, watching its every move, observing its breathing, monitoring its food intake. He would stay up late, ensuring the animal was comfortable, and would often sleep in the stables curled up on the cold stone floor, hoping to catch any sign of worsening. But sleep never came easily in the stable. The boy's mind would race, wondering if he had missed something, if there was something more he should have done. And yet, in the end, the boy had no choice but to continue working. If the horse survived, it was a silent victory, no praise, no recognition. If the horse died, it was another mark of failure on the boy's back. Either way, the boy learned to expect nothing. He learned to serve without thanks, to care without reward. And even when the horses were well, even when the boy did everything right, he was always one mistake away from disaster. The constant threat of failure, the constant fear of punishment, made every day feel like a battle. There was no time for doubt. There was no time to question the unfairness of it all. The stable boy had to move, had to work, had to care, because if he didn't, it could cost him everything. But sometimes, just sometimes, when a horse recovered against all odds, the boy felt a flicker of something, pride, maybe, or hope. It was a fleeting feeling, one that was quickly smothered by the next task, the next responsibility, the next threat. But in that small, quiet moment of relief, the boy remembered why he did it all. Because no one else cared. No one else would stay awake through the night to listen for a horse's breath, or care for it when it was sick, or cry over its loss. No one else would spend their days in the muck and grime, doing the hardest work without thanks. But the boy did, because it was all he had.
Chapter 7. Shoveling for status. The lowest of the low. To be a stable boy was to be nothing. You were seen by everyone, and yet, you were invisible. You weren't even considered a person. You were part of the castle's machine, a cog in the grand mechanism of noble life. A noble life that never touched you, never acknowledged you, except when you were needed. But even then, you were simply a tool, and in the end, tools were disposable. The most humiliating part of being a stable boy was the knowledge that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how many hours you spent shoveling manure, hauling water, or brushing horses, your status would never change. You were at the bottom, and that was where you would stay. For most boys, this was a painful realization that sank in over time. They came into the fortress wide-eyed, eager to prove themselves. But over the years, They learned the truth. There was no moving up. There was no escaping. You could work for a nobleman, care for his prized steeds, and still be considered no better than the filth beneath your boots. In the grand hierarchy of the fortress, stable boys were the lowest rung. They were beneath the kitchen maids, beneath the scullery boys, beneath even the dogs that roamed the castle grounds. And this wasn't just an opinion, it was a fact that everyone knew, a truth that existed in every glance, every whisper, every interaction. The knights, the squires, the cooks, the merchants, they all saw the stable boy for what he was: expendable. His work didn't matter to them, not unless it was done perfectly. And even then, his efforts were forgotten. As soon as the horses were saddled, and the knights rode off to battle, or celebration, the stable boy was not allowed the luxury of mistake. A single missed spot in the stall, a piece of feed dropped on the floor, or an improperly cleaned hoof could mean punishment. It didn't matter if you had been awake all night, tending to a sick horse, or if your hands were blistered from the hard labor. If you made a mistake, you were punished. There was no room for mercy, no allowance for imperfection. A servant's job was to serve perfectly, and if you didn't, there were consequences. And yet, the boy could never rise above this. There were no promotions, no rewards for hard work, no accolades or recognition. If a stable boy worked his entire life in the stables, he could hope for nothing more than a few coins at the end of his service. If that. There was no upward mobility. The few stable boys who were promoted to positions of higher standing, such as grooms or even squires, were outliers, rare exceptions. The rest stayed where they were, confined to the lowest level of the social ladder, forever unseen and unimportant. This feeling of insignificance ate away at the boy over time. The constant labor, the endless hours spent cleaning, hauling, and grooming horses, never seemed to lead anywhere. He spent his days staring at the horses, wondering what it would be like to be one of them: strong, free, powerful. The horses were the ones who mattered. They were the ones who were admired, who were groomed and fed the best, who were treated with care and respect. And yet, they were just animals. They could be sold, traded, or even slaughtered when they grew too old or too sick. The stable boy, on the other hand, was nothing. He had no value except in what he could provide, and when his work became too much to bear, when his body could no longer handle the labor, he would be discarded just like the horses. And so the stable boy learned to live in the shadow. He learned to work without complaint, to serve without expectation. He learned to endure the beatings, the humiliation, and the hunger. He learned to look at the horses with a sense of longing, knowing that he would never be like them. He would never be more than a servant, a boy in the shadows of a grand fortress. The worst part was that he couldn't escape. There was no place for him outside the walls of the castle. He had no family to return to, no friends to help him. He had no education, no skills, nothing that could give him a chance at a different life. He was trapped in a world that didn't care about him, that didn't even see him. And no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sacrificed, he would never escape it. He would be a stable boy. And the others, those who lived in the warmth of the great hall, who ate rich meals and wore fine clothes, never had to think about it. They never saw the boy, never understood what it meant to be invisible, to work day after day without ever being acknowledged, to be part of something so large and so important, yet to be nothing more than a tool in the hands of those who held the power. The boy worked, day after day, knowing that his life was nothing more than a collection of chores, a series of tasks that were always expected, never appreciated. He was part of the castle, but he was not part of the life inside it. He was the lowest of the low, and no matter how much he gave, no matter how hard he worked, it would never change. Chapter 8: Diseases, Parasites, and the Stench of It All. In the stables, illness was a constant companion. It wasn't just the horses that got sick, but the boy too. The cold, the filth, the constant exposure to diseases. It all took its toll. The boy lived in a world where disease lurked in every corner, in every breath of air, and it wasn't just the human illnesses that threatened him. It was the parasites, the infections, and the filth that came with caring for so many animals in such close quarters. The most obvious threat was the horses themselves. They were prone to all sorts of diseases, from the minor to the deadly. And when one of them fell ill, it was never just an inconvenience.
It was a potential disaster. Horses could catch colic, an illness that caused painful bloating and could kill within hours if not treated. They could contract glanders, a deadly infection that could spread from horse to human, turning the boy's world upside down with fever, coughing, and abscesses. And then there were the parasites, lice, ticks, and fleas that infested both the horses and the boy. They were small, invisible to the naked eye, but their presence was always felt. The boy would scratch at his skin until it bled, trying to dislodge the incessant biting. But no matter how much he washed, how much he scrubbed, the insects were always there, always creeping beneath the surface of his skin. The stables were a breeding ground for all kinds of diseases. The floors, covered in straw and manure, were rarely cleaned properly. The horse's waste piled up, and the smell grew unbearable. It wasn't just the stench of urine and feces. It was the sickly sweet smell of rot, the smell of infection, the smell of disease. It clung to the boy's clothes, to his hair, to his skin. No matter how hard he tried to clean himself, no matter how many times he scrubbed, it never left. The smell became a part of him, and so did the illnesses. When a horse contracted a disease, it was the boy who was blamed. He had to be the one to figure out what was wrong, to try to nurse the animal back to health. But even when he followed every instruction, every piece of advice given to him, it was never enough. The horses still died, or they still got sicker, and when they did, the boy bore the full brunt of the blame. The master of horses would storm into the stables, angry, demanding answers, his voice rising in fury. The boy would stand there trembling, trying to explain that he had done everything he could, but it didn't matter. He was just a child, after all. No one cared that he had no medical training. No one cared that he had no real way of diagnosing or treating disease. All that mattered was that the horse was sick, and it was his fault. And then there were the diseases that spread among the servants. The stable boy wasn't immune to the illnesses that plagued the rest of the cast. The common cold was one of the worst offenders, spreading quickly through the cramped quarters of the servants' dormitories, which were nothing more than dank, cold rooms filled with the stench of unwashed bodies and uncleaned floors. If one servant caught it, they all did. The boy would cough and sneeze, trying to stifle the sounds so no one would hear him. But it didn't help. He was expected to work, even when he was sick, and if he couldn't, there would be consequences. The cough would worsen, the fever would spike, but still he would be dragged from his bed, forced to work in the cold, in the muck, in the dirt. There was no time for sickness. There was no time for rest. But it wasn't just the illnesses that wore the boy down. It was the parasites, the lice, the ticks, that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He would wake in the morning, itching all over, scratching at his scalp, his arms, the lice would burrow deep into his hair, crawling along his scalp, laying eggs that would hatch into more lice. He'd try to comb them out, picking at the tiny irritating insects, but they were persistent. No matter how many times he bathed, no matter how much he washed, they came back. The fleas in the hay would bite his legs, leaving tiny red welts all over his skin. He'd scratch at the bites until his skin bled, but it never stopped. It was a constant, invisible torment that never ceased, day or night. And then there was the stables were a mess of manure, of straw, of old food and water left in the corners. The boy's clothes were never clean, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much effort he put into scrubbing and washing. His clothing was always stained with dirt, with dung, It was the same with his body. He was covered in muck and grime, and the smell of the stables clung to him. The other servants, those who worked in the kitchens or the scullery, or the hall, would look at him with disgust. They would turn away, pretending not to see him, pretending that he wasn't there. And the knights, the noblemen, they would look at him with pity, or worse, with disdain. He was the lowest of the low, the servant who worked in the dirt, who cleaned the horses' stalls and shoveled the muck. He was nothing but a tool, a thing to be used and discarded when it was no longer needed. But despite all the disease, all the filth, all the punishment, the boy continued to work. He had no choice. The stables needed him. The horses needed him, and without him, everything would fall apart. He didn't care anymore about being acknowledged, about being seen. He didn't care about the pity or the disgust that others showed him. All that mattered was the work, the horses, and the endless cycle of care that would never stop.
Chapter 9. Training without learning. Doing without knowing. The problem with being a stable boy was that you were always expected to know more than you were taught. You were thrown into a world of horses, saddles, and steeds. An entire world that was foreign to you. No one bothered to teach you how to care for the animals, how to understand them,
No, the expectation was simple. You learned by doing. You were meant to watch, to pick up tricks by observing older boys, or the master of horses. But no one ever stopped to explain why things were done the way they were. And even if you were lucky enough to be shown the basics, that wasn't enough. You were supposed to become proficient by sheer experience, by trial and error. And that trial often came with consequences. When a horse was brought into the stable for the first time, the boy was expected to know what to do. A new arrival could mean anything. A prized war horse, a noble steed, or even a simple draft horse for hauling supplies. But the boy, inexperienced and alone, would be left with little more than a handful of commands and a vague set of expectations. It wasn't a matter of learning, it was a matter of surviving. The horse didn't care if you understood its needs. If you failed to make it comfortable, if you missed a sign of distress or ignored a subtle indication of illness, it wasn't just the horse that would suffer, it was you. And the horse, more than once, would send a message with a kick or a bite. Most people don't realize how much of a stable boy's life is spent with trial and error. It wasn't just mucking out the stalls and carrying water. It was learning the behavior of each animal, each horse with its own temperament, preferences, and quirks. Some horses hated being fed in the morning. Others only took their grain at night. Some refused to allow their saddles to be strapped too tightly, while others couldn't bear to have them too loose. And those who didn't get the nuances would learn the hard way. It wasn't uncommon for a boy to receive a horse's wrath in the form of a bite, a buck, or even a dangerous kick if he misread the animal's body language. But there was no teach. The boy's only guide was the few words thrown at him by the master of horses, a quick correction, shouted in frustration, or a snide remark from one of the squires. "You're a fool if you can't tell when a horse is upset," one of them might say. And the boy, heart pounding in his chest, would be left with the chilling knowledge that every horse in the stable was silently judging him. Their eyes were sharp, their patience non-existent. They could sense the boy's fear, and they knew just how to exploit. Horses weren't the only ones capable of knowing weakness. The boy, out of necessity, learned to read the animals, but he had to do it through experience alone. And even when he succeeded, no one praised him. No one thanked him for getting a stubborn horse to eat its meal, or for calming an anxious steed before a joust. No, his work was expected, his skill was a given. If he succeeded, it was just another part of his job. If he failed, however, the consequences were swift. The worst part was that no one ever told the boy what he needed to know. He was expected to learn it, to become proficient without ever being taught. That's why when the master of horses arrived to inspect the stable, or when a knight arrived to check on his horse, the boy had to pray that everything was perfect. There was no room for mistakes. There was no time for uncertainty. A horse that was poorly fed or poorly cared for could mean the end of a stable boy's place in the castle. It could mean being thrown out into the cold streets with nothing but the rags on his back. If a knight came to inspect the stable, the boy would have to be ready with everything in place. The tack had to be clean and polished, the horses brushed and calm, the feed set in precise amounts. It wasn't just about appearance, it was about knowing exactly what the knight needed. You had to anticipate his requirements before he even asked. There were no shortcuts. If a horse was unprepared, if the saddle was incorrectly fitted, or if the reins were twisted, it wasn't just the knight's disappointment that the boy had to fear. It was his master's wrath. And yet, the stable boy was never truly trained. Instead, he learned through observation, through the subtle signs from the horses, and the occasional word from the other stable hands. But this made the job even more frustrating. It was as though the boy were expected to be both a servant and a scholar, learning not only how to tend to the horses, but how to understand them. A horse that didn't want to eat, maybe it was sick. A horse that refused to walk, perhaps it was tired or injured. A horse that bucked and kicked, it was angry. But why? No one explained these things to the boy. They simply expected him to understand, and if he didn't, he paid the price. When a new horse arrived, the boy had to quickly assess its temperament and figure out how best to care for it. A wild stallion would require a completely different approach from an old, sickly mare. He had to guess on the spot what each horse needed, how to feed it, how to approach it, how to handle it. Each horse was a puzzle, and the boy had to solve it without ever receiving a proper key. Sometimes if a horse became particularly difficult, the master of horses might step in, but even then it was never a moment of training. It was simply a show of dominance. The master would discipline the horse with force, showing it who was in charge. The boy was left to watch, to learn from the master's methods, but never to be taught explicitly. The lesson was the same for him as it was for the horse. Do as you're told or suffer the consequence. As the seasons passed and the boy grew older, he learned more about the horses, about their subtle language and behaviors. But the lessons were learned in fits and starts, a little bit at a time. Some lessons came with pain, some came with praise, but no one ever formally trained him. No one ever took the time to explain what he needed to know, and in the end, that lack of instruction made the job all the more dangerous.
The most dangerous lesson the stable boy learned was the lesson of silence. He was expected to remain silent, to keep his head down, and never to question his duties. The moment he spoke up, whether in protest or simply to ask a question, it was considered a sign of insubordination. The stable boy's voice was unwanted. His thoughts, his concerns, his confusion, they were irrelevant. The master of horses, the knights, the squires, they all saw him as little more than a servant, a piece of furniture, something that could be used but not heard. But silence didn't solve the problems that came with inexperience. It didn't teach the boy how to deal with a horse that had gone lame or one that refused to be saddled. It didn't explain why a horse that had been healthy one day suddenly refused its food the next. And so the boy continued to struggle, learning more from his mistakes than from any kind of structured instruction. Every time something went wrong, every time a horse became sick or aggressive, he would face the consequences. He learned that even a slight misstep could lead to punishment, and yet no one ever bothered to teach him how to avoid those mistakes. There was a particular moment that stuck with the boy, one that would haunt him for years. It came during the spring when the air was thick with the scent of fresh grass and the stables were busy with horses preparing for battle drills and tournaments. The castle had a prized stallion, a powerful warhorse that was as much a symbol of the Lord's strength as a living creature. This horse was legendary, a fearsome steed known for its speed and power in battle. It had been brought in from distant lands, a rare creature that demanded respect and admiration from everyone in the castle. One day, the boy was tasked with grooming the stallion. He had seen the older stable hands handle the beast before, but he had never been allowed to do so himself. He was eager to prove his worth. This was a chance to show that he knew what he was doing, that he was capable of handling such a majestic creature. The stable boy approached the stallion with caution, but confidence. He brushed the horse's coat, running the soft brush over its sleek black fur, marveling at how easily the horse allowed him to work. The stallion didn't fight him, it stood still as though it was waiting for something. The boy felt a flicker of pride. This was a moment of success. He was trusted with the prized horse. But then, without warning, the stallion began to fidget. It shifted its weight nervously, tossing its head back and forth. The boy froze, unsure of what to do. He had been told that horses could sense fear, but he had never truly understood how it worked until that moment. His heart began to race. He continued brushing, trying to calm the horse with soft words, but it didn't help. The stallion's fidgeting grew more erratic. It pawed at the ground, its hooves striking the stone floor with an alarming force. The boy hesitated, unsure of how to react. He tried to pull back, to give the horse space, but it was already too late. In an instant the stallion reared up on its hind legs, letting out a wild, furious whinny. The boy stepped back too late. The horse's front hooves came down hard, and one struck the boy's chest with a sickening thud. He gasped for breath, stumbling backward, pain searing through his ribs. He had never felt anything like it before. The horse was still agitated, its eyes wide with fear, and it kicked out again, this time narrowly missing the boy's face. The boy stumbled to the ground, clutching his chest as he struggled to breathe. He could hear the other stable boys running over, their voices a blur of concern and scorn. "What did you do?" one of them shouted. "You let it happen. You were too slow." The master of horses arrived moments later, his expression unreadable. He barely glanced at the boy on the floor. His focus was on the stallion, who had calmed down, though it still snorted and stamped its hooves. The master looked at the boy, who was gasping for air, his face pale from the shock of the blow. "What did you do?" the master asked again, his voice cold and hard. "I didn't."
the boy started, but his words were cut off by a sharp motion from the master's hand. "You didn't pay attention," the master said, his voice filled with disdain. "You didn't understand the sign. You let a dangerous animal loose in the stable, without knowing how to handle it." The boy's heart sank. He wanted to explain, to tell the master that he had been trying his best, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen, but he knew better than to speak. He had learned that much. Silence was safer. He nodded, slowly, his chest aching, but the master didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the boy, dismissing him without a second thought. The boy was left alone in the stable with the bruises of both his body and his pride. The stallion, now calmer, was led away by one of the older stable hands, but the boy was left to recover in silence. He knew that the incident would be remembered, that it would follow him for as long as he stayed in the stable. Every time a horse reared up or kicked, every time the master of horses passed by, the boy would feel the weight of that mistake. He would never be allowed to forget it, and that was the cruelest part of life as a stable boy. Failure wasn't just a momentary setback, it was a permanent scar. The mistake he made that day with the stallion would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a mark on his reputation that he couldn't erase. He could work harder, he could improve, but he could never undo what had happened. He was always one mistake away from being discarded, from being deemed unfit to care for the very creatures he had been entrusted with. And so the boy learned to carry the weight of that knowledge, to carry the burden of his failure, and to work without question, without complaint, without ever thinking that he could make a mistake. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the work, it was about surviving, and surviving meant doing without knowing, doing without learning, and always keeping your head down.
Chapter 10. Fires, Raids, and First to Die. The fortress, with its towering stone walls and impregnable gates, was supposed to be a place of safety. But the stable boy knew the truth. The castle was as vulnerable as any other place, and when disaster struck, it often began in the darkest corners. And for the stable boy, those corners were always the first to suffer. The sound of hooves pounding against the earth in the distance was the first sign. The air would grow still as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the shouts, the first murmurs of panic, the distant clamor of soldiers rushing to defend the walls. The boy knew what it meant, a raid. The fortress was under attack. The knights would scramble to their posts, don their armor and ready their weapons. The soldiers would prepare for battle, their shields glinting in the light of the torches, while the nobles cowered in the great hall, watching the events unfold from a distance. But the stable boy, he was expected to continue working as if nothing was happening, as if the chaos outside didn't threaten everything he had known. The horses had to be ready. As the raid approached, the stable boy would rush into the stables, shoving aside the straw and the hay, trying to find the horses that would be needed most for the battle. The knights would need their steeds, their powerful war horses, their swift courier, and it was the stable boy's job to make sure they were prepared. He would brush their coats, strap on their saddles, and make sure the horses were fed and watered, all while the sounds of battle grew louder outside the walls. But it wasn't just about the horses. When the first sign of danger came, the stable boy was often the first to be called into action. The gates would need to be closed, the horses would need to be tended to, and everything would need to be locked down to prevent anything from getting through. It wasn't a job anyone would envy, especially in times of attack. The stable boy was often sent to the back of the fortress to ensure the horses didn't break free, that no animals escaped into the chaos. He was in many ways the first line of defense, and if the worst happened, the attack breached the walls, the stable boy knew he'd be among the first to die. In the chaos of battle, the knights and soldiers would always have the upper hand, but for the lowly servant, there was no protection, If the walls fell, the stable boy would be caught between the invading force and the horses he cared for. He would be trampled or worse, struck down by a blade. The boy had seen it happen before. There were rumors of stable boys who had been caught in the crossfire during raids, crushed beneath the hooves of terrified horses, or struck down by raiders seeking to harm anything they could. No one cared for the stable boys during such times. They were expendable. As long as the knights and lords were safe, the lower classes were left to fend for themselves. And the boy knew that if the raid reached the heart of the castle, he would be one of the first to face the consequences.
And yet, the stable boy had no choice but to prepare. The horses would need him, and he would not abandon them. Even as the war drums echoed from outside, even as the knights mounted their steeds and rode off to face the enemy, the boy would remain behind, working quietly, tirelessly, to make sure the horses were ready for whatever came next. If the castle survived the raid, he would still be there tending to the animals, cleaning the stalls, shoveling the muck, and if the worst happened, if the castle fell, he would likely be one of the first casualties. In some ways it was a grim reality, but in others it was a certainty. Life as a stable boy was never easy, never comfortable, and in moments of crisis, it was only harder. The boy had long since learned that the world was an unpredictable, often cruel place, and when disaster struck, the stable boy's place was always at the bottom, expected to take on the heaviest burdens, expected to suffer the most. But the worst part wasn't just the danger from raiders or the chance of death. It was the sheer weight of the responsibility. When things went wrong, when the horses broke free or became sick, the blame fell squarely on him. And in times of conflict, in moments when every life was on the line, the boy knew that he would be held accountable for every mistake, every failure. If a horse was unprepared for battle, if it was not fast enough or strong enough, the fault would be his. He would be beaten, he would be punished, and if the castle fell, there would be no second chance. No one would care that he had done his best to keep the animals ready, that he had done everything he could to protect the horses from the invading forces. The stables, the very place where the boy spent most of his life, became both a refuge and a prison in times of attack. When the battle raged outside the fortress, the boy could take some solace in knowing that the horses were safe, that they had been prepared. But that safety was fleeting. The moment the gates were breached, the horses would panic, and the boy would be left to watch as the animals he cared for became part of the chaos, caught in the confusion of war, their hooves pounding on the stone, their eyes wide with fear. And so in the midst of every raid, every fire, every siege, the stable boy did what he had to do. He worked through the chaos, through the fear, through the uncertainty. He cared for the horses, made sure they were ready for whatever came next. He didn't have the luxury of fear. He didn't have the option of running. He had only one task: survival. The survival of the horses, and his own.
Chapter 11. Rare glimpses of the castle elite. The castle elite lived in a world that was separate from the stable boys. They were removed from the dirt, the muck, the sweat, and the never-ending labor that defined the boy's existence. To them, the fortress was a place of power and privilege. To the stable boy, it was a place of hierarchy and suffering. The knights and lords paraded in their armor, their cloaks, their fine clothing. The boy, however, worked behind the scenes, unnoticed, invisible, a servant whose existence was not worth acknowledging. But occasionally the stable boy would catch a glimpse of the elite. It might happen when the lord's horse was being led to the courtyard for a ride, or when a knight returned from a battle or tournament, proudly dismounting his steed and handing the reins to the boy. Those brief moments were rare. They were fleeting, but they were enough to remind the stable boy of the world he would never be a part of. The first time the boy saw the Lord up close was a moment he would never forget. It was during a grand feast held in the castle hall, the kind of event that was reserved for nobles, knights, and distinguished guests. The great hall was lit by dozens of torches, their flames flickering against the stone walls. The smell of roasting meat and fine wines filled the air. The guests laughed and talked in their fine clothes, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. In the center of it all, the lord of the fortress stood, his face lit by the firelight as he held court, entertaining visitors, receiving praise, giving orders. He was the embodiment of power, and for a brief moment, as the stable boy passed by the open doors to the hall, he glimpsed him standing tall, surrounded by his wealth and authority. The boy paused for a moment, his heart racing. The lord looked so much larger than life, so far removed from the dusty, cold stables. The stable boy knew his place. He knew where he belonged. But that brief glimpse of the lord, his commanding presence, was a reminder of the gulf between their worlds. The lord with his fine garments and his wealth,
his power and prestige, was the very definition of everything the stable boy would never have. And it stung. It stung because the boy knew, deep down, that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he labored to keep the horses in top condition, he would never be part of that world. He would never walk through the grand hall, never sit at the high table, never taste the fine food or wear the rich clothes. His world would always be the stables, the muck, the cold. But those glimpses weren't always about power. Sometimes the boy would catch sight of the ladies of the court, the noble women who moved through the castle like flowers in a garden. They wore dresses made of silk and velvet, their hair styled in intricate braids and curls. Their laughter was light, their voices sweet. As they passed through the corridors, often accompanied by a few guards, the stable boy knew they lived in a world that was completely separate from his own. They were treated with a level of care and consideration that he could never hope for. They were the flowers in the castle, nurtured and protected, while he was nothing but the root that kept the whole thing alive. One afternoon, the boy was assigned to saddle the Lord's horse before a ride through the wood. The Lord was preparing to leave for a hunting expedition, and as always, the stable boy was tasked with getting the horse ready. The castle grounds were bustling with activity, as servants prepared food, cleaned weapons and readied the steed. As the boy led the Lord's horse to the stables for its final check, he noticed the lady of the castle approaching the courtyard. She walked with grace, her gown sweeping along the ground, the gold in her hair glinting in the sunlight. She was surrounded by her ladies in waiting, all of them walking in step, their faces hidden behind delicate veils. For a moment the stable boy froze, his heart pounding. He had never seen her this close before. She was beautiful, radiant in a way that made the stables feel even more suffocating. He had always been aware of the differences between them, the elegance in her every movement, the way she was treated by everyone in the castle, the way she seemed to belong to the world of silk and jewel. And he was only ever a part of the background, the one who made sure her horse was ready for the hunt, but never allowed to be in her presence for more than a moment. As she passed by, her gaze fell on him, and for a brief second their eyes met. He quickly looked away, heart racing. He could feel the weight of her gaze, as if it had branded him. The briefest moment of recognition, but it was nothing, a fleeting glance. She moved on, continuing her path through the courtyard, while he returned to his work, leading the Lord's horse toward the gate. It was these brief, almost painful glimpses of the elite that reminded the stable boy of the separation between their world and his. It wasn't that he resented them. No, not really. They had their place, just as he had his. But it was the knowledge that he would never belong to their world that hurt. It was the awareness that no matter how much he gave, no matter how much he sacrificed, it would never be enough to change his place in the castle. The Lord and his ladies would ride off, leaving the stable boy behind to care for the horses, to clean the stables, to toil in the mud. And when they returned, it would be the stable boy who would be there, waiting quietly in the shadows, unnoticed, invisible, doing the work that no one else cared to do. No matter how hard he worked, he would always be behind the scene. He would always be the one who was seen only when something went wrong, when a horse was ill or a saddle wasn't prepared correctly. When the work didn't meet the standard, it was the stable boy who was blamed. But in those rare moments, when he caught a glimpse of the elite, when he saw the Lord, the knights, the ladies, he was reminded of the world he would never belong to. And that reminder stayed with him long after the horses were saddled and the courtyard had fallen silent. Because in the end, no matter how many horses he cared for, no matter how much effort he put into his work, he would always be the one left behind, the one who wasn't allowed to be part of the world he served.
Chapter 12. Could you ever escape this life? There were days when the stable boy dreamed of escape, not just of leaving the stables but of leaving the fortress altogether. He would lie on the hard straw bed in the loft, staring at the wooden beams above him, listening to the soft snorts of the horses below. In those moments he would close his eyes and imagine what life might be like beyond the castle walls, a world free from the endless labor, from the constant cycle of work and punishment, a world where he could sleep without the nagging ache in his body, where his hands could be clean, where he wouldn't be reminded every day of his lowly position. But deep down the boy knew the truth. There was no escaping this life. He was trapped, bound by invisible chains that kept him within the walls of the fortress. Even if he ran, where would he go? The villages beyond the castle were no better. The life of a peasant was no different. no more dignified than the one he led, and worse, there were no skills he could trade. He was only good for one thing: tending to horses. No one outside the fortress would care for a stable boy. He was nothing more than a servant, a child of the dirt, unworthy of a future beyond the stables. The boy had often wondered if he could ever rise above this life, if there was any hope of something better. But each time he thought about it, the weight of reality settled in. The nobles would never allow him to escape. His worth was measured by the labor he provided. As long as he was useful, he was tolerated. But the moment he became useless, he would be cast aside, just like the old horses that were sold off to the slaughterhouses when they could no longer carry the burden of battle. His life had been set from the moment he had entered the castle's gates, and it was a life he could not escape. There were moments when the boy would catch a glimpse of what might have been a flash of a nobleman's son, running through the halls with a smile on his face, playing without a care in the world, or a squire walking with purpose, holding the reins of his horse, already preparing for the life of a knight. The boy envied them. They had a future. They had a chance to become something. But for the stable boy there was no future. There was only the stables, the horses, and the endless cycle of toil. Sometimes, in the rare moments when he was alone, when the horses were fed and the stalls were clean, the boy would stand in front of the massive castle gates, staring out at the land beyond, the open fields, the distant hills. It all seemed so far away, so out of reach. He would imagine walking through those fields, free to go wherever he pleased. He would picture himself walking toward the horizon, never looking back, never thinking about the stables again. But those dreams never lasted long. Reality would always pull him back. The sound of hooves in the distance, the clang of armor, the master of horses shouting his name. It all reminded him that he belonged here, and there was no place for him beyond the wall. There were nights when the boy would lie awake, tossing and turning, his thoughts racing. He wondered if there was any chance of change, any way out. But the longer he thought, the more hopeless it seemed. The fortress was all he knew. The stables were his home, the horses were his family. And as much as he hated the work, the filth, the constant exhaustion, there was something familiar about it. It was all he had. It was the life that had been given to him, and he couldn't imagine anything else. And yet, every now and then the boy would catch himself thinking, what if he could leave? What if he could find a better life somewhere else? What if, just for a moment, he could escape the endless cycle of work and punishment, the constant pressure to be perfect, to never fail? But those thoughts were dangerous. They were illusions. The boy knew the world beyond the castle walls wasn't kind to those like him. He was a stable boy, and that was his fate. There was no escaping it. But the dreams didn't die easily. They lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him, pushing him to imagine a life that was different. A life where he wasn't just a servant, where he wasn't invisible. A life where he could choose his own path, where he could be free to do what he wanted, to go where he pleased. But that wasn't the life he was going to have. The stable boy knew that. Deep down, he knew there was no escape. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sacrificed, he would never be more than a servant, a shadow in the background. His life was tied to the stables, to the horses, to the endless cycle of labor that defined him. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no way out. This was his life. This was his fate. But still, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the horses were calm and the castle was quiet, the boy allowed himself to dream. He allowed himself to imagine a different life, a better life. Even if it was just for a moment, he let himself believe that there was more to the world than the stables, that one day, somehow he would find a way to escape, even if it was just for a brief moment, even if it was only in his mind.
Chapter 13. From stable boy to squire. The slim chance of rising up for many stable boys. The dream of rising above their station was a fleeting hope, a distant fantasy that was as unreachable as the stars. It was a story told in hushed whispers by older boys, who had spent years in the stables, watching the knights and squires go about their business, imagining what it would be like to leave behind the muck and the sweat, to step into the world of prestige and honor. But those stories were always far-fetched, always tied to luck or rare chances. The reality was much harsher. The dream of becoming a squire was reserved for the few, the ones who had connections, the ones who caught the eye of the right people. It wasn't something earned through hard work or determination alone.
It was about who you knew and whether or not the right person saw something in you. For the stable boy, the idea of being noticed by a knight or lord was laughable. He was invisible, always in the background, always the one who cleaned the horses and tended the stables without ever being seen. He was the one who was there but never truly part of the life within the castle. And yet, every so often a boy might catch a lucky break. A knight might take pity on a hard-working stable boy, or a squire might see potential in a young servant. But these instances were rare. They were the exception, not the rule. Most boys would grow up in the stables, learning the ways of the horses, becoming skilled in their care, but never rising above their station. The walls of the fortress were thick, and they weren't just made of stone. They were built from social barriers that kept the stable boy where he belonged, at the bottom. Even if a boy managed to impress a knight, even if he was noticed for his work, the path to becoming a squire wasn't easy. It wasn't just about grooming horses or cleaning saddle. It was about proving yourself worthy, and that meant learning to fight, to train, to live the life of a noble. It meant wearing armor, carrying a sword, and learning to defend yourself. But for a stable boy, this was an almost impossible task. He didn't have the training, the experience, or the privilege. He had never been taught how to fight, how to wield a sword, how to conduct himself in a knight's world. And by the time he realized he might want to try, it was often too late. Most stable boys never made the leap from their humble positions to become squires. They spent their days feeding the horses, cleaning the stalls, and attending to the needs of the knight. They were the ones who kept the horses ready for battle, but never had the chance to be part of the battle themselves. They were the ones who prepared the steeds for the grand tournaments, but never had the chance to ride in them. They watched from the sidelines, always in the shadows, always on the outside looking in. There were some, however, who were lucky enough to find a way out. These were the boys who had a spark, a certain something that caught the attention of a knight or lord. Maybe they were quicker, more agile, or simply had the right attitude. These were the boys who were taken under the wing of a squire, who were given the chance to train, to learn the ways of combat, to wear the armor of a knight. It was a long shot, a slim chance, but it was possible. But even for these lucky few, the transition wasn't smooth. They might be accepted as squires, but they were still bound to the world of servitude. They weren't knights yet. They had to earn their place. They had to prove themselves worthy of the title. And that meant more work, more training, more struggles. It wasn't enough to be a squire. You had to become a knight. And that journey was long, difficult, and fraught with challenges. The squire had to train in everything: fighting, horsemanship, swordplay, and etiquette. They had to learn the ways of the court, how to act like a noble, how to speak to lords and ladies. And even then, there was no guarantee that they would ever become knights. Many squires spent their whole lives as squires, never earning the title they so desperately wanted. The reality was that for most stable boys, the dream of rising up to become a squire was just that, a dream. The odds were stacked against them. They were born into a life of servitude, and they would likely die in the same position. The doors to the elite world of knights and nobles were locked, and for most boys they would never get a key. They would toil in the stables caring for the horses, and horses alone, never able to break free from the chains of their birth. But despite this, the hope never died complete. It flickered in the hearts of the boys, a spark that kept them going. It kept them working, kept them striving for something better, even if they knew deep down that it was unattainable. They worked hard, not just for the horses, but for the hope that one day, maybe they would be the one to catch the eye of a knight, to be pulled from the muck of the stables and into the light of a squire's life. It was a slim chance, but it was and as long as it existed, the dream of rising up from the stables remained. In the rare moments when the stable boy would catch a glimpse of the squires or the knights, he would feel that longing deep in his chest. He would watch them ride, their faces hidden behind gleaming helmets, their cloaks billowing behind them, and he would imagine himself among them. He would imagine riding into battle, commanding a horse of his own, wearing the armor of a knight, and standing side by side with the lords and ladies of the castle. It was a fleeting fantasy, a moment of escape from the crushing reality of his life in the stable. But for those brief moments, it made the work feel worth it. It made the endless days of mucking out stalls, of cleaning saddles, of feeding horses, feel like they mattered, like they were leading somewhere. But the stable boy knew, deep down, that he wasn't meant to ride with the knight. He wasn't meant to sit at the high table, or wear the gleaming armor. He was meant to serve
to work in the background, to do the work that no one else wanted to do. And yet in the quiet moments when no one was watching, when the stables were silent, he still drew, and that was enough to keep him going.
Chapter 14. From stable boy to squire. The slim chance of rising up. The path from stable boy to squire was an incredibly rare journey, almost a myth in its own right. For most boys, it remained just that, a tale told by the older hands to the younger ones, a hopeful story meant to spark ambition. But for the stable boy, ambition often felt like a distant dream, a horizon he could never reach. The truth was that the castle's world was a closed system, a fortress not just made of stone but of societal barriers that kept those within their walls from ever crossing to the other side. The knights and lords occupied a world of their own, a place where the stable boy could only dream of stepping. There were of course the rare exceptions, the one or two boys who caught the eye of a knight or lord, the ones whose loyalty and diligence were rewarded with the ultimate prize, a chance to rise beyond their station. But even for these few the climb was long and grueling, fraught with trials that would break most men. It wasn't enough to simply be a servant. It wasn't enough to know how to handle horses or clean stables. The stable boy had to prove himself worthy, not just with his hands but with his mind and body. He had to learn the ways of the knight, the art of combat, the etiquette of the court. It was a life of constant training, constant struggle, and most of all, constant rejection. But even for those who never reached the rank of squire, the idea of rising up was a constant presence. It shaped every decision, every movement. The stable boy might spend his days shoveling muck, brushing horses, and cleaning saddles, but in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about the future. He was always wondering if this was the day that would change everything, the day when someone would finally see his worth. Every action he took was measured against the faint hope that one day, someone would look at him and see something more than just a servant. The small flicker of possibility was enough to keep him going, even when the work seemed unbearable, even when the pain of exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. And sometimes there were moments when that flicker of hope seemed like it might grow into something real. Like the time when the lord of the castle stopped by the stables to inspect the horses. The boy had worked tirelessly to ensure they were all groomed and ready, every saddle in perfect condition, every horse fed and watered. When the lord arrived, his eyes scanned the horses, and then almost imperceptibly they moved to the boy. He was still young, still a child in the eyes of the castle's elite, but the lord's gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. There was no overt sign of approval, no smile, no praise, but for a brief instant, the boy felt seen. The lord nodded, just slightly as if acknowledging the boy's efforts. It was the smallest of gestures, but to the boy it felt like everything. It felt like the first crack in the door. But cracks were fragile things, and doors that were once ajar could quickly slam shut. The boy knew this, and so he kept his head down, focusing on the work, not daring to think that anything could change. After all, the lord's approval, even the faintest hint of it, was a rare gift. It was meant for the squires, for the knights in training, for the sons of noble families. The stable boy had no real claim to it, and even if he did, it would take more than a single gesture to move him from the stables to the training grounds. It wasn't that the stable boy didn't have the potential to be more. The truth was, he had the skills. He understood horses better than most of the squires. He knew how to care for them, how to soothe their nerves, but there was no one to teach him the other skills. The swordplay, the combat training, the courtly manners. The knights and squires had teachers, had mentors, had families who were invested in their success. The stable boy had no such advantage. He had no family, no money, no connection. When he did manage to get a glimpse of the world beyond the stables, the tournaments, the feasts, the moments of grandeur, he saw the disparity more clearly than ever. He saw how easy it was for a nobleman's son to rise through the ranks, to be trained in combat, to be given every chance to prove himself. He saw how the squires, even the ones who didn't have the talent, still had the opportunity. They had everything, the chance to rise, the training, the mentorship. They had the world at their feet, and all the stable boy had was the stable. All he had was his labor, his strength, his sweat. His work was essential, but it was invisible, and no matter how good he was at his job, no matter how much better he understood the horses than the squires, it didn't matter. He was still just a boy in the background, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. And yet every so often,
A glimmer of hope would flash in the boy's mind. What if he could be different? What if he could be the one to rise up? He watched the squires practicing their swordplay, watched them groom their own horses, preparing for battle. He watched them as they trained with knights, sparring in the yard, learning the ways of war. He imagined himself there holding a sword, wearing armor, riding into battle with the same confidence and skill that the knights displayed. For a moment the world felt open to him. For a moment he could almost feel the weight of a sword in his hand, feel the thrill of a tournament, the roar of the crowd. But then reality would rush back in. He would remember his play. He would remember the stables, the endless work, the exhausting, thankless labor that defined his existence. He would remember the knights and the squires, who had everything he lacked. He would remember that, no matter how hard he worked, he would never be given the same opportunity. And the dream would fade. It would flicker out, just as quickly as it had come. The life of a stable boy was one of survival. It was about enduring, about making it through the day, and then the next day, and then the chance to become a squire, to rise above his station, was a dream that would never truly be realized. The boy would work in the stables, cleaning, grooming, feeding, and caring for the horse. He would do this every day from dawn until dusk, his muscles aching, his hands cracked, his body covered in sweat and grime, and no one would notice, no one would thank him. He was just another servant, just another tool to be used until he was no longer needed. But in the quiet moments, in the rare instances when he caught a glimpse of something more, something better, he would hold on to that hope, even if only for a moment, because sometimes hope was all a boy like him had left.
But the rare moments of hope quickly faded. The boy knew that life in the fortress was never going to be easy, that it was going to be nothing more than endless work, with little to show for it. His dreams of rising up, of becoming a squire or a knight, were as distant as the horizon. They were fleeting illusions that lasted only as long as he allowed them to, before the harsh reality of his existence dragged him back into the muck of the stables. The walls of the fortress were thick, and no matter how much he wanted to climb over them, no matter how hard he worked, he knew he would never be able to scale them. But even with the weight of reality pressing down on him, there were still moments that made him question everything. There were still times when he looked at the knights and squires, watching their graceful movements, their powerful stances, their confident smiles, and in those moments he felt a burning desire to be part of that world, to be seen as something more than just a servant. He wasn't naive enough to think it would happen easily, but a small part of him still believed, however foolishly, that it might be possible. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for someone like him to rise. But rising up wasn't just about ability. It was about recognition. The knights, the lords, the squires, they all lived in a world where recognition was given based on bloodlines, connections and status. The stable boy had none of that. He had no noble lineage. He had no family to support him, no wealth to back him. He was a nobody, a mere servant whose entire value was measured by how well he took care of the horses. He could be the best at his job, could work harder than anyone else, but it didn't matter. His worth would always be limited to the stables. The boy had learned that lesson early. He knew that no matter how much effort he put in, no matter how much care he gave to the horses, he would always be at the bottom of the ladder. The squires and knights might pat him on the back occasionally, might offer him a nod of approval for his work, but it never went beyond that. They would never see him as an equal. They would never offer him a chance to rise above his station. He was simply the stable boy, the servant who cleaned up after them, who prepared their steeds for battle, who polished their armor and sharpened their swords. And yet there were those rare moments when the boy felt a glimmer of hope, when he saw the squires practicing their swordplay in the yard, when he watched them ride their horses with such grace and skill. He couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. He wanted to be part of that world. He wanted to know what it felt like to wear the armor, to ride into battle, to stand among the knights and the lords. He wanted to be more than just a servant. He wanted to prove to himself that he could be something more. But those dreams felt impossibly far away, like a distant star that he could never reach. The more the boy thought about it, the more he realized the brutal truth. The chances of him ever becoming a squire were slim to none.
There was no real path for someone like him to follow. There was no easy way out of the stables. No one was going to offer him a chance. No noble lord was going to look down at him and say, "You, stable boy, have what it takes to be a squire." He was invisible, unimportant, a tool that was used and discarded when it no longer served a purpose. In the moments when he allowed himself to dream, when he allowed the hope of something better to flicker in his chest, he would think about the future, about the life he could have if things were different. He would imagine himself standing in the courtyard, dressed in the fine tunic of a squire, his sword at his side ready to prove his worth. He would imagine riding alongside the knights, fighting in tournaments, winning glory. But those dreams always felt like a cruel joke. They were too far removed from the life he led, too far removed from the reality of his world. And then there was the fear that the dream would never come true, that he would be stuck in the stables forever. The fear that he would never be more than just a servant, a nameless face in the background, always working, always laboring, but never truly seen. The fear that he would die as he had lived, unnoticed, unimportant, forgotten by everyone. It was in these moments, in the quiet of the stables, when the boy truly understood the weight of his existence. He understood that his place in the world was fixed, that there was no escaping it. He had no noble blood, no connections, no family to back him up. He had nothing but his labor, his strength and his ability to care for the horses. And yet, in a way that was enough. The work gave him purpose. It gave him a reason to wake up every day, to keep moving forward. It was the only thing he could rely on. But still, every now and then, the boy would catch himself imagining what it would be like to have more than just the stables, more than just the horses. He would imagine standing beside a knight, riding into battle, feeling the wind in his hair, the weight of the sword in his hand. And for a brief moment, he would feel as though it was possible. He would feel as though he might one day have the chance to prove himself, to rise above the stables, and become something more. But then the moment would pass, and the dream would fade, and the boy would be left standing in the same place, doing the same work. It was a bitter reality, but it was his reality, and no matter how much he wished for something more, he knew deep down that he had no control over it. He was bound to the stables, bound to the life of a servant, and nothing would change that. The dream of becoming a squire was just that, a dream, a distant hope, never meant to be realized.
Chapter 15, Stable Boy No More. The day the stable boy finally realized he would never escape the stables was a quiet one. It was a day like any other, fog clinging to the stone walls of the fortress, the horses milling about in the stalls, the sound of hooves scraping against the cold floor. The boy was feeding them, moving between the stalls with practiced ease, when the realization came to him, as it often did, in a single simple thought: this is my life. At first he didn't know how to process it. He had spent so many years dreaming of something more, something beyond the stables, beyond the muck, beyond the endless labor. He had allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't a servant, where he wasn't invisible, where he was seen for his worth, not just his ability to care for the horses. But now, in the cold light of the early morning, he understood that those dreams were never meant to be. They were fleeting fantasies, born of hope and desperation, not of reality. He was part of the stables. He had always been part of the stables, and he would always be part of the stables. He could work as hard as he wanted, could care for the horses better than anyone else in the castle, but none of it would matter. The knights and the lords would always be the ones who mattered. The squires, the noblemen, they were the ones who rode into battle, who wore armor, who were respected. They were the ones who had power. And the stable boy, he was nothing, just a servant, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer needed. He had known this in his heart for years, but it wasn't until that moment, in the cold silence of the stable, that the full weight of it settled in. It wasn't a grand realization, one that hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. It was quiet, almost peaceful in its finality. The boy realized that he had been chasing a dream that could never be caught, that he had been hoping for something that wasn't meant for him, and with that realization, something inside him changed. It wasn't anger, though there was certainly bitterness. It wasn't despair, though the weight of hopelessness pressed down on him like a heavy stone. It was resignation. The boy accepted his place, the place that had been determined for him from the moment he had arrived at the fortress. He was a stable boy, and he would always be a stable boy. It wasn't a pleasant thought, it wasn't a comforting one, but it was the truth, and for the first time the boy accepted it. The stable boy worked on without complaint that day. He fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, groomed the steeds with the same dedication he always had, but there was a difference now. There was no longing in his actions. There was no fantasy of a better life beyond the stone walls. He didn't dream of being a knight, of wearing armor, of riding into battle. He didn't wonder if he might one day be chosen to become a squire. He simply did his job. The work was familiar, comfortable even. It was all he knew. As the day wore on, the boy's sense of self faded into the background. He was just another servant in the fortress, one of many, his face unimportant, his labor unnoticed. There was a sense of peace in that, a strange relief. The pressure of ambition, the pressure of wanting more, had been lifted, and in its place there was only the work, the endless, unremarkable work that made up his life. The other stable hands came and went, exchanging a few words with the boy here and there. They spoke in the same way, with the same wariness, the same resigned acceptance of their fate. There was no camaraderie between them, no sense of solidarity. They were all just doing their jobs, trying to survive in a world that didn't care about them. They were all part of the same machine, and none of them would ever escape. That night, as the stable boy lay in the hayloft, he listened to the sounds of the castle settling into sleep, the faint sound of laughter and music from the great hall, the creak of the wooden beams, the distant howl of the wind. It was all a reminder of the world that existed beyond the stables, the world of the knights and nobles, but it was a world he would never be a part of. It was a world he could no longer even dream of. The boy closed his eyes, his body exhausted from the day's labor. The stables were silent now, the horses calm and resting, but there was a part of him, deep inside, that still longed for something more. He would never admit it, not even to himself, but there it was, an ember of hope, small and fragile, but burning still. Even in the face of his resignation, the boy couldn't completely extinguish the idea that perhaps one day something might change. Maybe it wouldn't be today or tomorrow, but in the distant future when he had finally proven himself worthy of something more. But for now he lay in the hayloft, surrounded by the familiar smells of the stable, the weight of the work on his shoulders, and the bitter acceptance that he would always be the stable boy. And though the dreams faded, they didn't disappear completely. They never would. But now he knew better than to chase them. The reality of his life had finally set in, and in some strange way that was the only thing he could hold on to.
Chapter 16. A new beginning, or the same old path. The seasons changed slowly, like the years themselves, and the boy found himself in a new routine. The cold of winter gave way to the first touch of spring, the harsh winds dying down, the chill lifting from the stables. The world outside the castle seemed to come alive with new growth, with flowers blooming in the courtyard, with the grass turning green again. And yet inside the stables, life continued as it always had, silent, steady and unforgiving. Spring was supposed to be a time for renewal, a time for hope, for something better. But for the stable boy it was just another season of hard work, another cycle of the same tasks, the same responsibilities. The horses, though lighter on their feet, still needed care. The feed, though fresher, still had to be measured precisely. The saddle, though cleaned, still had to be adjusted perfectly. Nothing changed, and yet the boy began to notice something. It wasn't much, but it was there, a shift, a small alteration in the way people looked at him. It started with the knights. They began to acknowledge him more, or at least they seemed to. There were a few nods of approval when they passed him by. A momentary glance, a silent recognition. The master of horses was still as harsh as ever, barking commands and delivering punishments when the horses were not ready. But the boys who worked beside him, those who had been there for as long as he had, seemed to treat him with something like respect, something like understanding. The change wasn't drastic, but it was enough to catch the boy's attention. At first he wondered if it was simply a passing moment, a coincidence, or a figment of his imagination. He had long since stopped hoping for recognition or praise, so when it came, even in small doses, it left him uncertain. Did they see him now as something more than just the stable boy? Was he finally being acknowledged for all the work he put in, for all the care he showed to the horses? One morning, as he was grooming a particularly temperamental mare, the Lord himself walked past the stables on his way out. The boy froze. He didn't dare look up at the Lord, not because he feared him, but because for all his life he had been invisible in the Lord's eye. The lords and knights always passed him by, rarely giving him a second thought. He was just a servant, and they were above him, untouchable. But as the Lord walked past, something unexpected happened. The Lord for the briefest of moments, he looked over at the stable boy, his eyes scanning the horse, the boy, the work being done. The boy's heart skipped a beat. Did the Lord? Did he see him? For a moment it seemed like the world paused. "Good work, boy," the Lord said, his voice low, but the words, simple as they were, hit the boy like a blow to the chest. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The Lord was still looking at him, still watching. His hand rested briefly on the reins of the horse. The boy was grooming. Then he nodded once and walked away without another word. The stable boy could only stand there, stunned, his hands still on the mare's coat, his mind racing.
Good work. Was that really what the Lord had said? Was it a passing remark? Or did the Lord truly see him? For a moment the boy was unsure how to react. He had spent his life in the shadows, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. And yet here was the Lord, one of the most important men in the castle, offering him something so simple, so small, but something he had never received before. The recognition was a gift, an acknowledgement that he had value, even if it was just for that brief moment. It wasn't much, it wasn't enough to change his place in the world, but it was something. The boy continued with his work that day, his mind whirling with what had happened. He wanted to believe it meant something, that this was the start of something new, that the respect he had been quietly yearning for had finally come. But deep down, he knew better. He knew the way the world worked. He knew that one compliment didn't change anything. The nobility's world and his own were still separated by walls. Walls of status, of birthright, of wealth. He could work harder, be better, but that would never elevate him above his station. He would always be the stable boy. He would always be the servant. But something had shifted. The words of the Lord echoed in his mind. Good work. It had been a simple thing, but to the boy it meant more than he could say. For the first time someone important had noticed him, had taken the time to see the effort he put in, even if it was just for that brief fleeting moment. And in that small moment, the boy allowed himself a quiet feeling of pride. He was good at what he did. He had value, even if the world outside the stables didn't acknowledge it, even if he would never leave his place as a servant. He knew now that he was more than just a tool. He was a person. That feeling stayed with him for days, even as he continued his work in the stables. He worked with a sense of purpose, a sense of pride that he hadn't felt before. It wasn't about becoming a knight or a squire. It wasn't about escaping the stable. It was about doing the work with dignity, about knowing that his effort mattered, even if only in the smallest of ways. As the weeks went by, the stable boy found that the knights and lords began to speak to him more often. It wasn't much, a passing word here, a casual remark, but it was enough. The walls that had once felt so thick, so impenetrable, now seemed a little less daunting. He still knew his place, still understood the harsh reality of his life, but the recognition, the acknowledgement, changed something inside him. It wasn't enough to change his fate, but it was enough to make him feel seen for the first time in his life. And for that he was grateful.
Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten corners of history here on The Drowsy Historian. If you found yourself lost in the story, immersed in the quiet lives of those who lived in the shadows, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more tales of forgotten lives, untold struggles, and hidden truths. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Did this story resonate with you? Do you think the stable boy's dreams could ever have come true? Or was he doomed to the life he was born into? I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, rest easy and let history carry you to places you never imagined. Thanks for being part of the Drowsy Historian family, where history sleeps and we're all here to dream together.